The guard shoved Kale forward, and the doors of the audience chamber opened like the mouth of something enormous. He had 48 hours without sleep behind him, dried blood on his left temple from where they had dragged him out of his crashed survey pod, and every bone in his body was telling him to stay very still and say very little. He did not listen to his bones. The chamber was tall enough to swallow a building. Crystalline pillars lined both walls, each one humming faintly with a blue-white light that Kale had learned was not decorative. It was the Varath's way of broadcasting authority, a constant transmission of power pulsing through every surface of their architecture. 6,000 years of empire pressed down on him from every angle. Cathar stood at the center of the floor. He had 6 arms, which Kale still could not quite get used to, and a face that communicated superiority the way a wall communicates stone. He was the grand resonator of the Dominion's eastern expansion, which apparently made him very important, and he carried the particular posture of a man who had never once been told no. Kale Morrow, Cathar said, his translated standard grinding through a small device clipped near his collar. Survey pilot. The first human to cross into Dominion-recognized space. We have been deciding what to do with you. Kale kept his eyes level. He had spent 2 weeks as a prisoner on this station, sleeping in a room the size of a storage closet, eating things that looked like compressed gravel, and watching Varath guards patrol corridors that smelled like ozone and metal. He had spent every waking hour of those 2 weeks learning everything he could about the people who had taken him. I would love to hear it, he said. Cathar tilted his head. 4 of his 6 arms folded across his chest in a gesture Kale recognized as condescension made physical. Humanity is small. You have one inhabited world. Your technology is, at best, charming. He said it the way you might describe a child's drawing. We have decided not to act against your species immediately. You will remain here as a cultural sample, an observation subject. A cultural sample. Kale filed that alongside everything else he had no choice about right now. And to mark this arrangement, Cathar continued, we are giving you something. He gestured toward the far door. 2 guards came in pulling a chain. At the end of it was a woman. She was tall, nearly 2 meters, with silver-white skin and 4 arms held tight against her body, like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. Her hair was made of fine, dark filaments that shifted as she walked, and her eyes were a pale, fractured blue that caught the light from directions it was not coming from. She was thin in the way that speaks of long hunger, and her wrists and neck carried the marks of restraints worn far longer than a few days. She did not look up. A null singer, Cathar announced, and the word landed in the chamber with unmistakable contempt. She cannot resonate. She produces no usable frequency. She cannot communicate in any meaningful way, cannot contribute to labor, cannot fulfill any social function in our civilization. She is, by every measure we apply, without value. He spread 2 arms toward Kale in a gesture of hollow generosity. We thought it fitting, a broken thing, for an unproven species. The room made a sound Kale had come to recognize as Varath laughter. Low, harmonic, layered, and completely certain of itself. Kale looked at the woman on the chain. She had not moved. Her breathing was slow and deliberate, the kind of breathing that people develop when they learn that reacting costs more than it is worth. He looked back at Cathar. Thank you, he said. I will take good care of her. The guards removed her restraints at the door of their shared quarters and left without a word. The room was not large, but it had a viewport looking out onto open space, 2 sleeping areas, a food dispenser that Kale had partially figured out, and 4 monitoring devices he had already located and stopped pretending not to notice. She stood near the door for a long time after the guards left. Kale crossed to the food dispenser, spent 3 minutes wrestling with it, and produced 2 portions of something that looked like compressed purple clay, but registered as nutritionally complete. He set one on the table near her side of the room and sat down on the far end of the floor, putting as much distance between them as the space allowed. My name is Kale, he said. You do not have to talk. You do not have to do anything. The inner room has a lock, and you can use it whenever you want. She watched him with those fractured blue eyes, not hostile, something more complicated than hostile. The expression of someone running calculations that have always, until now, come out the same way. He started talking quietly, about nothing important, about his survey routes across the outer belt, about a dog he had back home named Benji who had chewed through 3 sets of headphones and shown no sign of remorse whatsoever, about the particular disappointment of bad station coffee at the wrong end of a 20-hour shift. He talked the way you talk to something frightened, keeping the sound steady and low and without demand. She did not touch the food that first night. The second night, she did. On the 3rd day, Kale was sitting by the viewport watching the stars rotate when something hit him in the sternum. Not physically. Not a sound he could name. It was lower than sound. A vibration that moved through the seat beneath him. Through his ribs. Through the base of his skull. He felt it the way you feel a bass speaker through a wall. Not heard but undeniably present. Carrying something inside it. He could not explain why, but it felt shaped like a question. He turned around. She was standing in the doorway of the inner room. Her filament hair was moving. Not from any breeze, but from something that originated inside her. Her eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that was nothing like the careful blankness she had worn since they first met. Cale held very still. The vibration shifted, deepened. It took on what he could only describe as texture, a shape that pressed against his perception, the way a word presses against the inside of your mouth just before you say it. He did the only thing that occurred to him. He hummed, one low, steady note, barely above silence, held for 3 full seconds. Her whole body went rigid. Then her eyes went wide. Not with fear, not with the cornered reaction he had half expected, with something else entirely, the shocked, electric expression of someone who has been knocking on a door for years and suddenly, without warning, heard a knock back from the other side. Her hand came up to cover her mouth. Her shoulders shook once. A sound escaped her that he had no name for, a quiet and broken exhale that was not crying and not laughter but something more primary than either of them, something that lives underneath both. He understood in that moment exactly what had happened. She had been speaking this whole time, in a frequency that no Varath instrument had ever detected, in a range that sat completely below their perception and below most of their technology. She had been resonating for her entire life, and every person around her had looked right through it and called her silent. He was the first person who had ever heard her. He kept humming. She stood in the doorway and shook, and he sat by the viewport and held his note, and it was the most important conversation he had ever been part of. What came after that was slow, painstaking work that Cale threw himself into, with the same focus he gave to deep space navigation. He pulled a vibration sensor from his salvaged survey kit, a small instrument designed to detect structural resonance in asteroid formations, and began recording what she produced. He displayed the waveforms on his tablet screen and let her watch herself being visible for the first time. When she first saw her own frequency graphed out as light on a screen, she touched the display with one fingertip and stayed very still for a long time. They built a language between them. It was rough and full of gaps, but it grew steadily. A sustained low pulse meant yes. A sharp rising shift meant no. The layered harmonics she could produce were more complex, full sentences that he could only partially translate. But he stayed with it with the stubbornness that had carried him through 2 years of solo deep space work in a ship he repaired mostly with determination and creative engineering. Her name was a frequency. The closest he could produce with his voice was something like Velia, and the first time he said it and she understood that he had shaped her name into something speakable, she pressed her forehead briefly against the back of his hand. He learned later that in Varath culture, that gesture meant something close to, "I acknowledge that you are real." He did not pull away. Piece by piece, she told him her history. Her parents had been resonance artists in the outer settlements, well regarded and serious about their work. She had been accepted to a primary resonance academy at the age of 7, which was remarkable, because her early frequencies showed a structural depth her teachers said appeared once in a generation. She had been gifted, she had known it. It had been the whole shape of who she was becoming. Then puberty shifted her frequencies, dropped them completely below Varath range, below their instruments, below everything their civilization had constructed to measure the world. Her teachers declared her defective. Her parents did not challenge the decision. She was reassigned, then reassigned again, and eventually became exactly what Kethar had called her in that courtroom. A null, a nothing, a broken element of the system to be passed along and, when useful, used to insult someone else. She had spent 4 years believing everything they told her. Cale listened to all of it through waveforms and slow translation, and the particular grammar of 2 people working very hard to understand each other. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up. "I want to show you something," he said. He took her hand, which she allowed, and placed both their palms flat against the viewport glass. "As deep as you can go," he said. "The lowest note you have. Hold it steady." She looked at him. A long pause passed between them. Then he felt it begin, deep beneath the surface of everything, a resonance that rose up through the station floor, through their feet, through the walls, through the seat of his lungs. The viewport glass began to tremble under their palms. A crack appeared at the lower corner, fine as a thread, a perfect fracture spreading slowly through material rated to hold against the full vacuum of open space. He stared at it. He had spent 2 weeks absorbing every piece of technical information the Dominion had made available during his orientation sessions. They had done this with obvious contempt, the way you hand someone a complex object expecting them to be baffled by it. What they had not accounted for was that Kale had a very precise memory and a professional interest in structural analysis, and he had used those 2 weeks to memorize everything he could find about the crystalline resonance cores that powered Dominion warships. Those cores operated on a specific lattice frequency. They were tuned precisely to the Verath resonance range, immune by design to any interference the Empire had ever encountered in 6,000 years of expansion across the galaxy. Any interference they had ever encountered. The crack in the viewport looked back at him like a door that had just opened. He started laughing. Not politely, not briefly, but fully, because the breathtaking scale of the mistake the Dominion had made was only just becoming clear in its entirety. They had looked at Velia and seen a broken instrument. They had never once considered that she might be playing a song they did not have the ears for. The vibration from her shifted, questioning. He turned to face her. "You are not what they told you," he said, and he held his voice steady when he said it. "You never were. Not for a single day." Kethar had given Kale open access to the station's navigation broadcasts during his first week. Another gesture of contempt dressed as administrative routine. The transmissions ran in a frequency the Dominion had never imagined a human could intercept. They had been wrong about that, the same way they had been wrong about nearly everything else. Kale had been quietly charting the Dominion fleet positions for days. 11 warships holding a loose formation between the station and the outer boundary marker that pointed toward Earth. He spread the chart out on his tablet and showed it to her without a word. She studied it in silence. Her filament hair drifted. He had a speech prepared about choice, about her right to decide what she wanted to do with her own ability, about how nothing here was his decision to make for her. He did not get to give it. She reached out and placed one palm flat over the fleet positions on the chart, covering all 11 ships at once under a single hand. The answer was in the gesture, and it was not a small one. They were summoned to the audience chamber the following morning. Kethar had arranged it with theatrical precision, the way men arrange things when they have already decided how the moment ends. The full court was present. The banners of the 6,000-year lineage hung from the ceiling on both sides. Admiral Primus Shenvor attended by long-range resonance projection, his image sharp and authoritative in the air above the chamber floor. This was to be the formal declaration of humanity's incorporation into the Dominion. The document would be read. The decision would become permanent record. Kale walked in with Velia beside him. She walked with her head level, and her 4 arms at her sides, not tucked in, not folded away. She was not making herself small. She moved the way she must have moved at 7 years old, before the world spent years teaching her that her presence was a problem. Several guards tracked the change in her bearing and did not know what to do with what they were seeing. Kethar began his formal address. Kale let him commit fully to the first sentence and then spoke across it without raising his voice. "Before we continue, I want to ask you one thing." Kethar stopped. The amusement that crossed his face was slow and certain. "The human wishes to speak." "In 6,000 years of expansion," Kale said, "how many species did you encounter that resonated completely outside your detection range? Not weakly, not poorly, completely outside it, a frequency you had no instrument built to measure." Kethar looked at him the way you look at someone who has said something that does not quite compute. "That question does not apply. All civilizations capable of meaningful development resonate within established parameters." "Right," Kale said, "within your parameters, because you only ever built instruments to find what you already expected to be there." He looked at Velia. "Go ahead." She did not look at Kethar. She did not look at the banners or the court or the projection of the Admiral Primus. She looked at the room as a whole, 6,000 years of absolute certainty arranged before her in all its polished confidence, and she sang. It struck Kale in the chest like a hand pressing flat against his ribs. It moved through the floor, through the crystalline pillars, through every surface of the station's architecture simultaneously. He heard nothing with his ears. He felt everything with the rest of him. The Verath felt nothing at all. That was precisely the point. What they did feel, one after another, was their communication system going dark. Alert after alert fired across the monitoring consoles as 11 crystalline resonance cores came apart with the unhurried, exact efficiency of someone who understood the structure far better than those who had built it. No explosion, no fire, no visible force of any kind. Each lattice simply untuned itself, lost coherence, collapsed into harmonic noise, and went still. 11 warships, 40 seconds. The chamber came apart. Guards reached for weapons. Officials grabbed for communication devices that connected to ships that were no longer answering. Shenvor's projection flickered, stuttered, and cut to nothing as his own ship's core lost the frequency that held it together. Kethar was on his feet with all 6 arms extended, his resonance hammering through the chamber at a frequency designed to overwhelm, to command, to shut everything else down. His voice, when it came, had a crack in it that Kale had never heard from a Verath before. "What has the Null done?" he said. "She has a name," Kale said. He kept his hands at his sides. He kept his voice level. "Her name is Velia. She is one of the most gifted resonance artists your civilization has ever produced, and she has been telling you exactly that for her entire life." He let a moment of silence land before the last part. "You were not listening." Weapons were pointed at both of them. Neither of them moved. The 11 dark ships holding motionless in the formation outside the station said everything that still needed to be said. Kethar stood in the ruin of his fleet's capability and looked at a woman he had chained and traded and called worthless, and something moved across his face that Kale had never seen on a Verath in all his weeks on the station. It was not anger, though there was anger beneath it. It was not calculation, though the calculation was already starting. It was the look of a man who had just understood, all at once and with no way to unfeel it, the precise size of how wrong he had been. Negotiations began the next day. They were long and careful, and full of the particular friction of powerful people being forced to revise positions they had held for a very long time. Humanity received formal recognition of sovereignty. More importantly, Velia received what no treaty language could fully contain: the official acknowledgement that the Dominion had been measuring value and intelligence with an instrument that had never been correctly calibrated, and that every null singer they had discarded, chained, reassigned, and erased, deserved a full and formal reassessment. Kale was present for every session. So was Velia, seated at the table as a recognized party, not an object, not a demonstration, not a gift. She sat with her back straight and translated through Kale's interpretation system, with the patience of someone who has had to work 3 times as hard as everyone around her simply to be heard, and who has decided, definitively, that patience is not the same thing as acceptance. 6 months later, the first human diplomatic ship docked at the station. Kale was on the observation deck with a crew of engineers, diplomats, and scientists who had traveled an extraordinary distance to stand in a place that, 6 months earlier, humanity did not know existed. The ship came into view slowly, running lights steady against the dark. Nobody on the deck said anything. Velia stood beside him. He felt the question forming before it fully arrived. He nodded. She turned toward the gathered crew. All those human faces turned toward the viewport and the ship and the new and enormous fact of what they were standing inside, and she sang. None of them heard it, not with their ears, but every single person on that deck stopped at the same moment, mid-sentence, mid-movement, mid-breath. An engineer near the far console closed her eyes. A diplomat who had spent decades in high-pressure rooms put one hand flat against the viewport glass as though he needed something solid. Someone near the rear door simply went still and stayed that way. The song moved through the room in a frequency the human body had always been capable of receiving, and had simply never, in all of human history, been offered. It was not music in any form they could have named afterward. It was something beneath music, beneath language, the kind of signal that exists in the part of a person that was formed before words were invented. They all felt it, and every one of them listened. That is the thing the Dominion could never have understood in 6,000 years of expansion, because understanding it would have required them to question the most basic assumption they had ever made. They built everything on the certainty that if they could not perceive something, it did not matter. They looked at Velia and saw a defect. They looked at humanity and saw something too small and too new to take seriously. They handed a woman they had decided was worthless to a species they had decided was beneath notice. And then they were surprised. Kale had grown up on a world where the first rule of survey work is that your instruments only find what they were designed to look for. If you want to find something new, you have to hold open the possibility that silence is not the same thing as empty. You have to stay curious about what you cannot yet detect. You have to listen into the frequencies you do not yet understand. Velia had been singing for her entire life in a voice so deep that the civilization around her could not hear it. It had not made her voice smaller. It had not made her less than what she was. It had made her exactly what she was in the moment. Kethar fastened a chain to her wrist and smiled his wide, empire-certain smile. The most powerful person in that room. Neither of them spoke for a long time on the observation deck after the ship docked. The crew moved around them quietly. Some of them wiped their eyes without entirely understanding why. Kale looked out at the stars and thought about a cracked viewport and a shared language built from waveforms and patience. He thought about a woman pressing her forehead against the back of his hand. He thought about a question he had felt in his chest before he knew what questions felt like without words. He thought about what the Dominion had handed him. He thought about what they had believed they were giving away. Beside him, Velia looked out at the same stars, and her filament hair drifted in the light around her, and she was not hiding a single part of it. She was not hiding anything at all. Kale Morrow, former survey pilot, first human ambassador to the Vareth Accord, personal memoir.